Dust Hollow, Texas, autumn of 1884. The train tore through the desert's breath like a restless spirit, its whistle cutting into the dry afternoon air. A cloud of steam rose, curling into the pale sky, and the sparrows that had perched on the telegraph wire scattered like thoughts too fragile to stay. Dust swirled around the platform as the wheels screeched against the rails, and when the train sighed to a stop, a woman stepped down. Her boots landed on the warped planks with a hollow sound. Leather cracked from travel, laces dulled by dust. In one hand she held a small suitcase, its corners battered from the road. In the other, she clutched a folded letter, creased, softened by touch, yet still her only compass. Her name was Anya Ivanovna. Her skin, pale as chalkstone, contrasted the dark braid coiled beneath her grey bonnet. The lace at her throat had yellowed with years, and her coat, once a fine garment, now bore the exhaustion of too many miles and too few destinations. Her eyes searched the crowd with restrained hope, scanning faces for the one she had been promised. A black carriage rolled into the station yard, horses polished, wheels gleaming with pride. A woman in maroon silk stepped out first, posture sharp enough to cut the air. Her husband followed, solemn and stiff. And then their son, a young man with slicked hair, gloves half pulled, the same face Anya had seen in a photograph months ago. Her pulse quickened. The letter in her hand had begun with "My dearest Anna," and every word had whispered of kindness and a shared dream. She took a step forward, but the woman's gaze met her first, a glance that traveled from bonnet to boots, measuring, weighing, dismissing. Anya offered a polite smile, a small curtsy, and introduced herself with deliberate care. Her voice was gentle, careful, threaded with the melody of her homeland. That single sound shifted the air. The mother's eyes narrowed. The son's expression faltered. The father looked away. The world shrank to the rhythm of their breaths, the silent judgment hanging between them. A word slipped from the young man's lips, confused, uncertain, about her accent, her tone, her very being. The mother crossed her arms and spoke with ice, her words brittle and exact. They had expected refinement, proper English, a lady fit for presentation. Not a woman who sounded like she'd stepped out of another world. Anya's heart stumbled. She tried to explain. Her English learned from letters, her words shaped by effort, by hope. But the father laughed dryly, mocking the honesty she had offered so freely. The son shifted, mumbling half-hearted regret, his shame already folding into convenience. When they turned and walked away, the gravel beneath their carriage wheels sounded like thunder. The world around her blurred. Faces turned. Murmurs crawled through the air. She stood alone on the platform, a bride unchosen, a foreigner rejected by pride sharper than any blade. Rain began to fall. Soft, thin droplets that traced the edges of her face and seeped into her coat. The letter slipped from her hand, landing in a shallow puddle. Ink bled across the page, names dissolving into shadow. She watched the words drown, then lifted her gaze toward the open road, an endless gray stretch that led into a town she had never seen. Dust Hollow. A place she had come to become someone's wife. Now, it would only know her as the woman left standing in the rain. She gathered her suitcase and walked forward, not with despair, but with a quiet defiance. Every step whispered the same vow. She had survived worse things than rejection. The town met her with silence. Boarded windows, swinging signs, the faint creak of a saloon door. Evening sank slowly over the rooftops, and the wind carried the scent of dust and wet wood. By the general store, a man tied his horse. His hat brim shadowed his face, the lines around his mouth carved deep from years of solitude. Caleb Morgan. The name moved through Dust Hollow in low tones. The rancher who spoke little, who buried his grief in work after his brother's fever took him. He had come for salt and molasses. He stayed because he saw her. The woman by the water trough looked like someone time had forgotten. Soaked through, trembling, holding nothing but her will to keep standing. Her bonnet drooped, her suitcase hung loosely from her hand. Her eyes had that still, gray depth that comes only from those who have lost everything but themselves. Caleb didn't speak at first. He studied her quietly, something stirring beneath his calm. Not pity, not fascination, but recognition. The hollow endurance of someone who keeps living when the world has given them no reason to. He walked toward her. His boots met the wet dirt, steady and sure. The rain darkened his coat, his voice low when he spoke. A simple question, offered like a lifeline. Her answer came with hesitation, her accent bending around every word. Without another thought, he took off his coat, held it out. She hesitated, searching his face for mockery, for danger, for the cruelty she had already met that day. There was none, only calm eyes, steady as the land itself. The coat was heavy, lined with fur, still warm from his body. She took it slowly, her fingers trembling. He handed her a small cloth bundle, bread wrapped in an old handkerchief. Not much, his tone implied, but enough to see the night through. Her throat tightened around gratitude that refused to become sound. He motioned toward his wagon. The offer was simple: warmth, a roof, a pause. No promises, no expectations. She wanted to refuse. She wanted to say she didn't need help. But her strength had run thin, her fingers numb. He gestured again. Just until morning. She climbed aboard, and the rain swallowed the silence between them. The wagon moved out of town, wheels cutting through the mud. The landscape stretched wide, dry plains, scattered cottonwoods, a creek murmuring faintly in the dark. The Morgan Ranch came into view, a small house perched on a hill, a barn slanted from last year's storms, a porch that creaked with history. Caleb helped her down. The door opened to a world smelling of cedar, smoke, and quiet. A fire glowed low in the hearth. He pointed toward the table, fetched the kettle, and filled it with water. She sat, still unsure. He left briefly and returned with a blanket and clean socks. Too large, but kind. Without words, he placed them near her, then disappeared outside into the rain. Later that night, she found a small basin of hot water left by her door, steam rising gently into the cold. A folded card rested beside it, the handwriting uneven but deliberate, not out of pity. Anyone who stands in the rain and stays standing deserves a roof. She pressed the note to her heart, and for the first time since the train left her behind, she closed her eyes and rested. The morning came soft, golden, and quiet. The house had changed. The air carried the scent of tea and flour, and the silence had grown warm instead of empty. Caleb rose early, as always, but when he passed through the kitchen, she was already there. Anya moved carefully, learning where everything belonged, touching nothing she hadn't cleaned first. The rhythm of her movements filled the room, gentle, steady, deliberate. She spoke little. But each gesture, each act of care, felt like music rebuilding itself after years of silence. Caleb watched her from the doorway, saying nothing. He had not asked for help, but he did not stop her either. The quiet between them was a language all its own. Every afternoon, while she swept the porch or baked cornbread, he worked outside, repairing the barn door, mending fences, oiling tools, no words, no thanks. Just the soft exchange of effort. Her bread, his labor, both unspoken ways of saying, "I see you." One evening, she dropped a cup, the shatter cutting the silence clean in two. She froze, stammering an apology, hands shaking as she reached for the shards. Caleb crouched beside her, gathering the pieces with his calloused fingers. "It's just a cup." Her breath trembled. Back home, even broken things had meaning. But he looked at her, not with judgment, not with comfort, but with the still certainty of someone who knew that strength was often quiet. And for the first time in years, she felt seen. That night, she placed the broken porcelain in a small box under the window. It was not a reminder of failure, but of beginning. The morning sun climbed slowly over the horizon, gilding the frost that clung to the fields. The world seemed caught between sleep and waking, that fragile hour when everything felt suspended. Caleb stood by the porch, tightening the strap on his boot, when he heard movement inside. The soft scrape of a chair, the clink of enamel cups, the murmur of water poured into a kettle, all part of a rhythm that had quietly formed between two souls who had never intended to share a roof. Anya emerged with her shawl pulled tight. Her hair braided neatly beneath her bonnet, her hands already dusted with flour. She moved like someone rebuilding her existence piece by piece, careful not to disturb the silence that made her feel safe. Caleb nodded toward the corral. "You need air." His eyes said more than his mouth ever did. She hesitated, then followed. The horses waited, their breath curling in the chill. Caleb saddled two, his old mare for her, steady and patient, and a younger one for himself. When he handed her the reins, their fingers brushed. Neither looked away. They rode side by side through the open pasture. The world stretched wide, endless sky, low grass turning gold, cottonwoods trembling in the wind. She looked freer in motion. The lines of worry softened around her mouth. Her back straightened, her eyes lifted to the horizon. The wind caught her braid, and for a fleeting moment, the years of exile and rejection seemed to fall away. Caleb pointed toward a group of calves grazing near the fence line. His words came few and plain, explaining what to watch for, the glassy stare of sickness, the sluggish gait of fever. She listened intently, her accent folding around her curiosity. When they stopped to rest, she plucked a sprig of prairie sage and rolled it gently between her fingers. The scent rose sharp and sweet. "For tea," she murmured, slipping it into her pocket. They sat on a fallen log, sharing jerky and water from his flask. The wind stirred between them, brushing her cheek and his silence alike. Her gaze wandered across the horizon. "Your land," she said softly. "It has no walls." "Like the sky forgot to stop." Caleb tilted his head. "Never thought of it that way." "In my home," she continued, her words slower now. The sky felt close, heavy, like something waiting to fall. He didn't ask more. He didn't need to. The weight in her voice said enough. They rode back as the sun sank low. The ranch came into view, painted orange by evening light. The world felt quieter than before, as if the land itself had paused to listen to what neither of them could yet admit. Inside, she prepared supper, stew simmering over the stove, bread rising by the hearth. Caleb sat nearby, polishing the worn leather of his saddle straps, the faint scent of oil and smoke filling the space. When she spoke again, her voice trembled between memory and confession. "Before the war, I was a teacher. Music, small children, little hands on piano keys. I thought sound could make the world gentler." Her eyes drifted toward the window, unfocused. Then the soldiers came. They took the pianos first. Then the voices. Caleb's hands stilled. She went on. "We learned silence. It was safer that way. But silence can kill too, just slower." The air between them thickened. Caleb set the leather aside and looked at her, not as a woman speaking sorrow, but as someone trying to reclaim the right to be heard. "You still have a voice," he said finally, his tone more a truth than a comfort. "You just need a place where it won't be punished." She turned, eyes bright with unshed tears, and nodded once. That night, when she finished cleaning the dishes, she found something waiting by the windowsill. A small wooden carving, a treble clef, etched with a rough knife but shaped with care. The wood smelled faintly of cedar. She touched it lightly, her lips curving into the smallest of smiles. It was not a piano, but it was a song all the same. Days turned into weeks. The rhythm between them grew stronger, not as husband and wife, not yet, but as two people whose silences finally spoke the same language. When he worked outside, she kept the house warm. When she baked, he brought in wood. When she fell asleep early, he left small things by her door, a new cup, a folded scarf, a note with no words at all. Then one afternoon, the sound of hooves broke the stillness. A carriage appeared on the road, gleaming far too clean for Dust Hollow's weary dirt. The same family that had once turned her away, the Carters, now approached with forced smiles and gold trim. Caleb saw them first, standing by the barn with an axe in hand. He wiped the sweat from his brow, said nothing, and waited. Anya stood in the doorway, drying her hands on her apron. Her stomach turned cold at the sight. The mother stepped down, her perfume cutting through the dust like arrogance disguised as civility. The father followed, cane tapping for effect. And then the son, Michael, with his perfectly parted hair and trembling pride. They approached her with flowers that were already wilting in the heat. Words spilled, practiced, and empty. Talk of misunderstanding, of gossip, of reputations to mend. Anya listened, unmoving. Their voices dripped with self-justification. Each sentence meant not for forgiveness, but for convenience. Michael's gaze wavered between her face and the house behind her, his confidence shrinking with every heartbeat. He spoke of second chances, of dowries, of comfort and respectability. She answered with stillness. He tried again, the same hollow promises, the same polished lies. Then her voice, when it came, was calm and unflinching. "I am not interested," Michael faltered, disbelief staining his pride. "Why not? You'd be cared for, respected, better than—" Caleb's shadow fell across the porch, his tone flat, his presence sharp as the blade he carried. "She doesn't need comfort from a coward." Michael flushed, but Anya stepped forward before the air could break. Her voice was clear, steady as rain. "You left me in the storm. You said nothing while I stood alone. You come now because the town whispers your name, not because your heart remembers mine." The young man's composure cracked. The father muttered something about generosity. The mother looked away. Anya's eyes burned. "I am not a sale. My accent, my voice, they belong to me. I will not carve them away to make you comfortable," Michael sneered, words slurred with humiliation. "Then rot here in your shack with your mud and your silence." But she didn't flinch. She turned and walked inside. The door opened behind her like a choice made final. The family hesitated, then turned back toward their polished carriage, their outrage dissolving into the dust they had once left her in. Caleb watched them go, the axe still in his hand but his eyes on her. That evening, the table held a folded note beside the bread she had baked that morning. The handwriting was rough, uneven, but deliberate. "I don't buy anyone. But if someone stays because they choose to, I'll plant flowers across this whole land for them." Her throat tightened. Later she found him in the barn, mending a broken latch. She stood quietly until he looked up. "I saw your letter," she said. He nodded once, returning to his work. "I'm not here because I need safety," she whispered, "or kindness. I'm here because I choose to be." When he looked up again, her eyes held no fear, no uncertainty, only truth. She placed her hand over his, rough and warm from labor. "I returned their money. The gifts, even the flowers. I gave them to the church for someone who needs them." He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth softening in the candlelight. "I'm not a product," she continued, "and my voice, it doesn't need to change to be heard." His voice came low. "You don't need to change at all." "No," she said, "but maybe together we'll grow." The night settled around them like an old song. Outside, the wind brushed against the barn, and the lantern's flame danced gently. When she passed through the kitchen later, the cracked flower pot she had meant to throw away now held fresh soil. A single wildflower swayed inside, fragile but alive. It was enough. Spring crawled quietly across Dust Hollow, slow and patient, softening what winter had hardened. The cottonwoods swayed again, their leaves whispering silver when the wind passed through. The ranch that had once stood cold and empty began to breathe, not loudly, not suddenly, but like a chest learning the rhythm of peace. Word spread through town, carried on the same lips that once whispered judgment. The foreign woman at the Morgan Ranch could play music, not just play, teach. Children began to appear on the path leading up to the house, boots muddy, hair tangled, clutching nickels in their fists or wildflowers as payment. At first, only a few came, ushered by mothers too curious to resist the rumor. But soon, laughter drifted from the open windows, the hesitant notes of scales and half-learned songs spilling into the air. Anya sat beside each child with patience carved from loss. She guided small hands over the keys, letting them find their own rhythm instead of forcing perfection. Her accent colored every instruction, gentle and melodic, turning even mistakes into melody. Some lessons ended with music, others with tears. The children asked questions about her homeland, about the war, about whether angels spoke in different languages. She answered only what her heart allowed, and when she smiled, They smiled too. Caleb rarely entered during lessons. He would linger outside, feeding the horses, hammering nails, trimming the porch boards so they wouldn't creak under little feet. His silence was a kind of harmony that filled the spaces between her notes. When the last child left, she would sometimes find small things near the piano, a polished key from the barn, a handful of fresh hay scented with lavender, a jar of honey from his last trade in town. He never mentioned them. She never asked. One evening, when the house had gone quiet, she sat by the window and stared at her hands. The same hands that had once trembled while clutching a torn letter now moved with purpose. The scars of her journey hadn't vanished, but they no longer ruled her. She didn't hear Caleb come in. He placed something beside her, a wooden crate wrapped in burlap. When she unwrapped it, she froze. Inside was an old upright piano bench, keys yellowed but intact. It was in the church, his voice said, without needing to speak. No one played it. Figured it was lonely there. She touched the wood with reverence, running her fingers across the faded grain. The air filled with the faint scent of dust and hymn books. She sat, pressed a key. The sound came thin but alive. The melody that rose wasn't from memory. It was new, born of the land she stood on now. It wove between them like a thread, hesitant, tender, certain. Caleb stood behind her, his hands deep in his pockets, eyes down but soul wide open. When the last note faded, she turned to him. "I call it sincerity," she said softly. He nodded. "It's not perfect. Neither are we." They didn't need to speak more. Outside, the first crickets of the season began to sing, their fragile song rising to meet her own. That night, the wind carried the sound of piano strings over the valley, soft and haunting, like the ghost of something once broken finding its way home. By the time summer bent toward harvest, Dust Hollow had begun to see her differently. The townsfolk who once looked past her now nodded in greeting. The blacksmith's wife brought her eggs. The pastor's daughters brought hymn sheets for lessons, and even the sheriff's boy carried a bouquet of thistles, insisting they were strong flowers just like you, but peace never comes without a test. The harvest festival arrived, and with it the town's fragile civility. The main street filled with laughter, fiddles, and the scent of roasted corn and whiskey. Strings of bunting fluttered above tables stacked with pie and cider. Anya wore a simple blue cotton dress and her old bonnet, hair braided loose. She hadn't wanted to come, but Caleb had asked once, gently, without insistence. "You don't have to," he'd said, "but I wouldn't mind showing you off." So she went. For a time, everything was easy. The townsfolk smiled. The schoolteacher thanked her for the children's progress. The pastor's wife complimented her cooking. Caleb hovered nearby, speaking little but never far from reach, his hand occasionally brushing hers as if to remind her that she wasn't alone anymore. Then came Michael Carter. He arrived late, whiskey on his breath, pride in his stride. His parents trailed behind him, faces stretched into smiles that trembled under guilt. He saw her instantly, standing near the cider table, radiant under the lamplight. "Well, if it isn't the accent herself," he called, his voice slicing through the laughter. Conversations faltered. Eyes turned. Anya stiffened, her hand tightening around the cup she held. Caleb's gaze followed the sound, his expression unreadable. Michael swaggered closer, the smell of drink preceding him. "Didn't know the town started hiring music teachers from overseas," he sneered. "Guess we import everything now, even wives that didn't work out." The crowd tensed, half shocked, half curious. Anya didn't move. "I prefer what I can taste," she said, her voice even. Michael smirked. "Bet you preferred what Caleb gave you too, huh? That why you stay out there in the mud?" Caleb stepped forward, slow and deliberate, the silence stretching like a drawn bow. Michael raised his cup mockingly. "What's the deal, Morgan? Teaching her English for payment, or are the lessons a little more personal?" The word struck harder than the whiskey in his hand. Then the sound came, clean, sharp, final. Caleb's fist meeting Michael's jaw. The man crumpled into a table of pumpkin bread, the crash sending dishes flying. For a long heartbeat, no one moved. Then whispers spread, rippling through the crowd. Caleb stood over him, breathing steady, eyes dark as stormlight. He didn't look proud. He looked finished. He took Anya's hand and led her from the hall. They walked beneath the cold moon, leaving behind laughter that slowly resumed in their wake. The road was quiet, the earth crunching beneath their boots. When they reached the fence at the edge of the field, she stopped. "Why?" He wiped his knuckles on his sleeve. "Because I don't let cowards talk like that. Not to anyone. Especially not to you," her breath caught. The night air pressed cool against her skin, but warmth bloomed deep within her. "Once," she whispered, "I stood on a platform with no name. I wasn't a bride. I wasn't a woman. I was no one. But tonight," she stepped closer. "Tonight I felt like someone you wouldn't let go." His fingers intertwined with hers. The wind moved softly through the field, carrying the echo of fiddles from town. For the first time since she'd arrived in Dust Hollow, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt chosen, not with vows or rings, but with action. The night the fire came, it didn't roar at first. It whispered, a low, hungry hiss that crept through the dry grass, carried by wind and fate. Anya smelled it before she saw it, the faint, acrid curl of smoke slipping through the cracks of the kitchen window. When she stepped outside, the horizon glowed orange. Flames licked the barn's roofline, their reflection burning wild in her eyes. "Caleb!" she screamed, running barefoot into the yard. He was already there, shovel in one hand, blanket in the other, body lit by firelight. "Stay back!" His voice cut through the chaos. But she didn't. He ran into the blaze, shouldering open the barn door as the horses thrashed in panic. The roof groaned, embers raining like stars. She saw his silhouette, moving fast, guiding animals out one by one, covering them with wet cloth, ignoring the flames that clawed at his skin. A beam cracked and fell. She screamed his name, but he dove forward, pushing the last two horses free before the roof collapsed behind him. When it was over, the barn lay half-burned, the air thick with ash and grief. Caleb sat in the dirt, his arms blistered, breath ragged. Anya knelt beside him, her tears streaking through soot. "You fool," she whispered, touching his face. "You stubborn, brave fool." His smile was faint. "They were yours too." In the days that followed, he worked slower. The burns on his arms turned raw, his movements stiff, but he refused rest. Every dawn she found him by the ruins, hammering new beams, rebuilding what he'd lost as if the act itself was prayer. She left salve by his bedside, water by his chair, a soft cloth folded where he'd find it. He never thanked her with words, but each offering disappeared by morning. One evening she found something resting on her pillow, a thin band of dark iron, shaped imperfectly but with care. It wasn't gold or silver, but it fit her finger, as though it had waited for her. She sat on the bed for a long time, the firelight flickering over the metal's dull shine. It was not a proposal, not a declaration. It was something quieter, a truth forged in labor, loss, and choice. At dawn, she joined him on the porch. The sky turned from violet to gold, and when he saw the ring on her hand, no words were needed. Their shoulders touched, breath mingling with morning air. "No one said anything," she whispered. "Didn't have to." And together, they watched the day begin. By late spring, the ranch wasn't just land. It had become a sanctuary. Children returned weekly, bringing music and laughter, their voices spilling through open windows. The townsfolk no longer called her that foreign woman. They called her Angel. It had begun with a little girl who'd whispered to her mother, "Is she really an angel?" When asked why, the child replied, "Because Mr. Caleb said when she plays you stop feeling afraid." The name stayed. And Anya didn't deny it, because somewhere deep inside, she understood. One evening, she played a soft tune while Caleb stood behind her, hands folded, eyes lowered. His breath brushed her ear, a whisper between words. "You don't need wings to bring peace." Her fingers faltered for only a moment, enough to let him know she heard. When the town held its first spring concert, the mayor asked her to open the night. She wore white, simple, unadorned, the iron ring glinting against the lantern light. Caleb stood behind the crowd, hat low, arms folded, I once believed I had to sound like everyone else to be loved, she began, voice steady, accented still but proud. But someone once told me you don't have to understand every word to know a heart. She looked toward him. This song is called To Be Seen. It's for anyone who's ever stayed silent too long. Her fingers touched the keys. The melody rose like dawn, slow, golden, patient. It didn't beg for attention. It simply existed, soft and whole. The crowd listened without breathing. When the final note faded, they stood, applause breaking the night open like thunder. Later, beneath the lanterns strung across the square, she found him. I don't speak perfect, she said, smiling through tears. But I am here, and I'm not leaving. He brushed his thumb across her hand. That's all I need, he murmured. Enough to plant a garden around this old heart. She laughed softly, leaning against him. No vows, no altar, only presence, courage, and a promise lived through every day. And so, in the heart of Dust Hollow, where the wind still carried old songs and new beginnings, a woman once rejected for her voice became the sound that steadied a man's soul, and a cowboy who rarely spoke taught the world that love doesn't always need words. Sometimes, it just needs the courage to stay.